Hello, you beautiful meditative minds, and welcome to this space and time. My name is Gabriel Lugo, and here I talk from self to self. I was having a conversation with somebody today, and she brought a point about her rewards, I would say. She didn't call it that. But the rewards of her recent meditative journey. And although she didn't associate it directly with it, she was able to realize that this is what was happening as our conversation went on. And it brought about a point that is very interesting for any of us who have started a meditative practice or a mindfulness style of expanding our perception, which is to say that you perceive reality as something that is much more relaxed than the neurotic usual upbringing that we have, the conditioning of our mind in modern society. And so it made me think about the process that happens when you are relaxing your mind. You see, meditation is not an activity, and I try to be very careful when I talk about this with people, because the words themselves in our language, as I will emphasize later on, are not very descriptive. They don't carry a very strict meaning to what we mean, especially our language in modern society. I'm borrowing from Spanish, English, Latin, Italian, just any language that has been founded or developed over the time that we have been looking at reality from a materialistic point of view. And to give you an example of what the things come up is that this is something that I even started saying or thought about saying, and I had to correct myself in this conversation. That was how we reap the benefits of our effort when meditating, which I will get into in just a little bit. But you see, the wording is wrong, because there is no effort in meditation, but rather there is a relaxation of the activity of the mind. And by us using words like effort, we inherently, it's almost like a subconscious thing that seeps into our mind. And when we're meditating, we're trying to create an effort to strain ourselves, as we're so used to when trying to achieve something. And it is so foreign to us in our society, in our culture, in our mindset, to think that we can relax the mind by some sort of activity. We seek these things. We think that, say, psychedelics, for example, or any other mind-altering substance can provide this relaxation. And to some degree, they do, but they are still an activity. They are still a mimicking of the relaxation that is possible through the nature of the self, the nature of each and every one of us. So when we look into other activities, for example, extreme sports, or any sport for that matter, then extreme sports are maybe a little bit more efficient in bringing the state of no thought to the moment that we can use it, of course, as an example. But any activity rather that is used for bringing the activity of the mind to its minimum is going to elicit this response in us. And so we associate these things that we do with meditation. And this is why sometimes meditation can be very difficult for many of us who are in this modern society that is so concerned with doing, and with practicing and making an effort. And here's where the philosophy of the Tao with Wu Wei comes into play, and it's a very different or difficult concept rather to grasp, because it is the art of action without premeditation. And to think that this is what we're doing naturally all the time. It's just that we're adding the activity of the mind to it. And from there, we're complicating things. But nevertheless, we stand in that hyperactivity of the mind most of the time. And when somebody integrates in their life any sort of mindful activity, mindful presence, or the center of it, which is meditation, then something funny happens. And this is the core of my topic today, which is what I call permeation of the mind. You see, the mind is, in this regard, as a sort of membrane for information. This membrane is usually very contracted. It's directly proportional to the mind activity that this membrane can contract. And so the information that it can filter through or permeate is very little. It's very specific and is prone to a lot of anxiety, because the less information you can work with, then the more anxious you become. You can really relate to this easily by any scenario, any situation in which you have very little knowledge, information about what it is. You're probably sitting right now, or laying down, or maybe doing chores right now, and you are very much aware of enough information for you to be comfortable listening to my voice and feel safe. However, if I were to suddenly, by some sort of magic, snap you out of where you are, and I place you on an upside down mountain made of nails with flying canisters and a sun that is shining from underneath the nails that somehow vibrates and change from mountain to ocean, you would be very perplexed. You would know very little about this environment, and you will start feeling afraid, anxious, and not safe. And so, in the same way, when we have a very active mind and we start getting this anxiety, this is exactly what is happening. There is very little information that makes sense to you. It is not coherent. Your reality is not something that you can understand. And the vast majority of us have been brought up in this environment of not knowing and always fearing what is to come. So we live in a state of anxiety and uninformed. Now, of course, I'm not even talking about the intellectual understanding that makes us anxious. I'm talking about the nature of the mind. The mind being overactive is like being overheated. And so we work that way. You can alike this to the pupil of the eye. You see, the eye, depending on the light that is present in the environment, will naturally contract and expand the pupil so it can absorb a certain amount of light, and this is a natural process. But you see, in the human mind, we are living in darkness because that is the nature of this density or dimension of reality, which is a contraction of consciousness, so it can work with very little information. And this is the beauty and the scary part of this reality, that we have to work with very little information. So of course, if your pupil is contracted and you are in darkness, you will work with very little information. Only the information that seems to keep you from falling, from perceiving things that are threats, and just simply surviving within this dark environment, because your pupil is so contracted and it hasn't expanded itself to allow for more light to get into the eye and naturally perceive more of the surrounding. And this is exactly what is happening with our minds. It is exactly the nature of our state of anxiety as we live with a contracted pupil, always looking at the faintest possible discernment of light to survive, to make sure that we're safe. And so meditation brings in something different, which is the relaxation of the mind, much like the pupil dilates and allows for more information to come through the eye and be able to discern more, to transcend the basic need of survivability that we're all concerned with, which is natural, it's normal. But a relaxed mind is able to permeate a lot more information than a contracted one that is stressed out. Stress means exactly that. Just like when you work out your muscles, you incur into muscular stress, and that stress is a contraction of the muscle. In the same way, our mind is contracted all the time. In weight training, we have this term called overreaching, which is a part of the periodization that one subscribes to or simply plans in our program. To overreach, as the word says, the limits of our capacity to bring stress to the nervous system by the means of weightlifting and possibly some other activity, exercise. But this is only done every 4 to 5 weeks, depending on who created your program, and is meant to create a stress that is so high that your body will definitely break homeostasis, and when it brings you back to balance, it will enhance the capacities of it to overcome a similar stress in the future. This is the adaptation that we're looking for. But this overreaching shouldn't be done too often, and you should be able to measure when you're able to support this with your rest, nutrition, and of course, even though it's not directly related to, but we know it does affect it, your mind. So you have to be in a very calm state when recovering from this. Well, you see, in our society, we are living in an overreaching state every single day. We put too much stress in the mind. And so, as we have seen over the past decades, even though our consciousness obviously has been expanded and we have much more information, it is the nature of the mind, or rather, the unnatural state of the mind that has been exacerbated by our current activities and our current interests in culture and society in general, that creates this overreaching state. And so the call for this, again, is meditation. And now you see, this is the funny part about one using any practice that is mindful. It doesn't have to be the classical meditative sitting in a position and trying to calm the mind or allowing the mind to calm down. No, it's any mindfulness state in which we can allow ourselves to be. And what happens always, without exception, is that the permeation of the mind, the pupil, dilates, and naturally more information will come through. However, this information can vary, and this is why we step into the ocean of mysticism when we try to discuss the information that has been permeated, because it is not of an intellectual nature. It is not of a practic, analytical, say, organization in which we can relate to it and make it pragmatic. Rather, it is a emotional, at the very core, or at the very least, of the perception of this information. And it naturally gets into the territory of ineffability, being unable to describe the information that is being absorbed by the mind or being allowed through the mind. These things can be what we call downloads all the time. They could be even channelings, which many people say they start channeling entities. Or it could be simply poetic stuff, poetic words that somehow make their way to our minds in a way that we can't describe it. And this is exactly what was happening to the person I was talking to, who had been experiencing these bursts of information that, even though she couldn't ascribe a source to it, it was just naturally popping up in her mind. It gave her a very reassuring sensation of being calm, being at peace, and something inspiring in it. Now, for those who follow me in the Law of One would know that anything that is of a positive nature, well, clearly, you don't have to follow me in the Law of One for this, but anything that is positive will always bring a sensation of inspiration, of wonder, of mystery, in the same way that we would wonder ourselves as kids and question nature, reality, in the same way. And it really brings the desire to know more, the desire to experience this information more. And this is the permeation of that which is ineffable. This is the filtering through the mind of that light that is of a higher density, of higher nature. And this is all because we are relaxing the mind. This is because we are allowing the thoughts to be, and we're not relating to them. We're not being the thoughts. We're not identifying with the thoughts, but we are just present in the moment. And these packets of information, these bundles of light that filter through the mind, are very likely to be poetic in its nature. And there is a reason for that. A lot of people, skeptics and those who want results and that want to, they are still playing the game of beating the universe, and they want to get something out of what is happening that is practical, that can be applied to their lives, and they can somehow enhance themselves, or, like I said, beat the game of reality. They would question and say, if it's poetic, it has no meaning. It is just some sort of inspiration, just like somebody telling you, I believe in you, right? However, I would say that like Watson used to say, language is dead poetry. There is so much truth in that, because you see, language is the most dry way we have to explain reality. It is almost like answering somebody when they ask you, do you love me? And you try to use as many words as possible. The person will be so turned off by all the words that you say. Whereas a simple hug would express a lot more than that, than so many words. And so we live with corpses in our mouth when we speak. When we try to be descriptive and analytical about all of these things. And poetry is much more meaningful and valid to explain reality than descriptive language, because it deals with emotions. It deals with the machinations of the mind to create or elaborate its own view, its own perspective. And this is the type of information that we receive or allow ourselves to be, because it's not like it's coming from a different source. And much like a lot of people may say that yes, they channel other entities, there is only one entity in this universe. And it's quite alright to say, I have many thoughts, or I am a constant thought. Both are correct and true. And it is only our capacity to divide our self into different beings if we want. But the deeper we inquire, the more we find that there is only one self. And so when meditating and receiving this information, to me it is more like we are allowing the natural information that is out there, and that it is us, to be permeated, like I said, through this membrane, which has pores that are constantly contracted by the reasons I explained before in our conditioning. And these pores now are expanding, dilating, relaxing. And so more fluidity of the liquid of reality can actually come through and inundate our minds. And this is what happens with us when we begin to live a life more relaxed, which is happening right now for a lot of people. Interestingly, it is inviting certain people to relax themselves, and at the same time is also allowing others to contract themselves to its maximum until they reach the point of rebound, let's say, for the return to self. We experience this in so many ways, and the most important thing is to keep in mind that even though we receive or allow this information to come through, and it is impossible to describe to others, like synchronicities. Synchronicities are impossible to describe to others, although you can tell the tale of how you felt something completely out of the ordinary that makes no sense in consensus reality. But in the same way, you are simply allowing to be yourself more, and this is a sign of that. You are living in a state of more acceptance rather than rejection, as we're so used to. This creates a calming of the mind so that information can flow through without too much duality in the way that rejects it, and it's always anxious to understand if it's beneficial or not. We simply allow things to be. There is a short poem, if we can call it that, in Zen that says, "The wild geese do not intend to cast their reflection, and the water has no mind to retain their image," which is a beautiful way to say that our minds have reality does not intend to cast their reflection on us, and yet it does so. There is no agenda by reality, and the water, our minds, has no desire to retain that image. So this brings us to the present moment and invites us to look at anything that is our life right now and accept it, not by a force of action, but rather as a way to allow things to be and not get in the way of what is happening. You don't get involved. You don't push the wheel of life generating more karma. You simply allow the inertia to be, which beautifully wraps up with the idea that you don't get involved in your thoughts when you're meditating. You're simply allowing them to be, because they are inertia of previous actions and other thoughts in your past, but they are no longer anything that you can identify with, and should be that way. With that, I come to the end of this episode talking about the permeation of the mind as we relax ourselves And I hope, as usual, that you got something out of value. I appreciate you listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.